I'm John Bolton. I was Donald Trump's longest-serving national security advisor.
Ambassador Bolton, you served as Donald Trump's national security advisor for 17 months. What was Donald Trump like to work for as president?
Well, he was very disorganized in his management style. I said in my book it was like working inside a pinball machine. Unlike other presidents like George H.W. Bush, who were comfortable with an orderly decision-making process, particularly on national security matters, Trump often listened to the last person in the room, and cabinet members knew that, and it made it very hard to get things done in an organized fashion and to do long-range strategic planning, which we were rarely successful at.
Did you get a sense he listened to advice or took advice?
I think he listened sometimes. In the 2016 campaign, Rudy Giuliani was asked by a reporter, "Does Donald Trump ever listen to you?" And Giuliani paused and said, "Yeah, about 20% of the time."
And how often would he listen to you?
I thought 20% was a pretty good batting average.
When we see what has happened in the last 6 months or so, the return of Donald Trump to the White House, is this one of the biggest second chances in American political history?
It's certainly almost unprecedented, Grover Cleveland being the only other president who served 2 terms interrupted by another. And I think that given that Trump spent 4 years at Mar-a-Lago stewing about his grievances and his enemies, he and his aides spent 4 years planning what they would do when they came back.
How much of the way he's running the US government now is retribution?
I think retribution is a major element of what Trump wants out of a second term. He's a man who feels endlessly aggrieved by everybody. Some grievances are large, some are small. He complained, for example, about a picture of a painting of him that was hung by the governor of Colorado in a gallery of American presidents in Denver. Now, I don't know who has time to go through their pictures and portraits around the world, but Donald Trump does.
Was there a sense then, first time round, he was underprepared for the job and so knew what to do with the second coming?
Well, he was totally unprepared for the first job. On Election Day, I remember speaking to Trump campaign advisors who were sure they were going to lose. I think most outside observers would say he completely wasted the pre-election transition work. The actual transition itself accomplished little, and for his first 6 months in office, neither he nor most of the people around him who had never been in government before really knew how to proceed. So much of the first term was spent learning just sort of where the basics were to take place. By the end of that time, that process was probably well understood, but that's when COVID hit.
So are we seeing now a more polished, more refined Donald Trump, or a Donald Trump more prepared to carry out what he wanted to do the first time around?
I wouldn't say a more polished Donald Trump. I'd say the same Donald Trump who this time is surrounded by yes men and yes women who are prepared to agree to what he wants to do without saying things like, have you considered this information? Have you looked at these alternatives? Do you understand these potential consequences? A lot of Trump's supporters say that in the first term he was constrained by people who didn't want to let him do what he wanted to do. That's not true. He was advised by people who wanted him to know that he could make better informed decisions if he chose, and he just didn't choose to.
Often 100 days is the most common measurement for a president's term in office. Measure the first 100 days as to how they're going to go. How would you sum up Donald Trump's first few months as second-term president?
Well, I think there's been a lot of sound and fury. Looking back from 4 years after the first 100 days, it'll be interesting to see how much of it actually carried into effect, how much really was for the media, how much was for the base, and how much really changed. Obviously, at this point, we can't tell. But I think, particularly given the scrutiny of the courts and the press of reality in national security affairs, it may turn out that a lot of what happened in the first 100 days doesn't last.
What has the United States lost?
I think the coherence of the NATO alliance, the stability of multiple other bilateral alliances, the belief that the U.S. was trusted even when people disagreed with it. This is not measurable in dollars and cents terms, which is really all that Trump understands when he understands anything. And so the long-term impact, which can only be negative, really can't be measured at this point, nor can we see what mitigating efforts people may be able to make in the next 4 years or what needs to be done at the end of Trump's term to repair the damage.
Under the Biden administration, there was full-blown support for Ukraine in its war against Russia. Under President Trump, there was a pause in the aid that went to Ukraine and that extraordinary scene in the White House Oval Office when you saw that exchange between President Trump, Vice President Vance, and Ukraine's President Zelensky. What was your reaction?
Well, it was a disaster. In the first 100 days, Trump has burned through decades of goodwill, trust, and reliance that America has built up over the years. He doesn't understand the stability that the alliance structure led by the United States created for the world. We've lost a lot just in the first 100 days. I think that scene alone, played out on live television, had more impact harmful to the NATO alliance than almost any other single act since NATO was originally formed. You know, Biden supported Ukraine, but ineffectively. Weapons system debates were dragged out over a long period of time. Should we attack them? Should we provide Abrams tanks? Should we provide F-16s? There was never a strategic distribution of the aid that might have allowed the Ukrainians to push the Russians out of Ukraine. So now the situation is not nearly what it might have been, notwithstanding NATO unity. Even so, Trump effectively reversed the American position. He is now more in support of the Russian position than support for Ukraine. He's given Russia enormous concessions. He's agreed even before negotiations really begin on the substance that there will not be a full return of Ukrainian territory and territory sovereignty, which was the NATO position before he took office. There will be no Ukrainian membership in NATO, which has been the U.S. position since 2008. There will be no NATO security guarantees. There will be no U.S. security guarantees. The only problem the Kremlin has with any of that is they didn't ask for enough. And had they asked for it, they might have gotten it.
So the United States has swapped sides.
Basically, Trump has done a 180 to move the U.S. position to be closely aligned with the Kremlin. Trump thinks Putin is his friend, and he thinks Trump is an easy mark that he can use his KGB skills against, and which he has, in the first 100 days, used to great advantage, particularly with respect to the Ukraine. Many of Trump's closest advisors, like Steve Witkoff, another Manhattan real estate dealer with no international experience, has voiced Russian propaganda and communicated it directly to Trump, who has in turn talked about it.
When you were advising then President Trump back in 2018 and 2019, Russia was already taking some issues with Ukraine, and we'd seen the annexation of Crimea. Were you concerned President Putin could carry out an all-out war on Ukraine, and did you advise the president of your concerns?
I think we were always worried about Russia's objectives because of what Vladimir Putin and other Russians had been saying since 2005, when a speech to the State Duma, Vladimir Putin said the breakup of the Soviet Union was the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century. And in subsequent statements, in summary fashion, basically said he wanted to recreate the Russian Empire. Trump did some things during his first year plus in office, like allowing Tomahawk cruise missiles to be delivered to Ukraine. He did it because Barack Obama had refused to do it. And so in Trump's mind, he reversed the Obama policy. But we didn't carry through with what we should have been doing, which was sending much more equipment, doing much more training for Ukraine, and really responding more effectively to the Russian actions in 2014, the first invasion that the West did not respond to effectively.
Why do you think Donald Trump has aligned the United States position more with Moscow than with Kyiv?
Trump thinks that international relations are basically equivalent to the personal relationships between the heads of state of the countries involved. So if the U.S. and Russia, we find Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin having good personal relations, then the two countries have good relations.
Is he right?
No. Trump sees this as purely personal. He doesn't really understand much about the background. I think Putin, who is one of the coldest-blooded leaders I've ever met in international affairs, sees the world through the prism of Russian national interest.
So in the first 100 days of his second term, has Donald Trump been played by Vladimir Putin?
Absolutely. Just to give an example, Donald Trump said during the 2024 campaign on many occasions, the Ukraine war never would have taken place had he been president. A statement that's neither provable nor disprovable, but shows how Trump thinks he's the center of attention of almost everything. Shortly after the inauguration, as I think the beginning of the manipulation, Vladimir Putin said he agreed with Trump that if Trump had been president, there would have been no Ukraine war. Then he released Mark Foley, a long-held American hostage. President Lukashenko of Belarus released another American hostage, and then there were other things. This showed Putin appealing to Trump, using Trump's self-centered nature to get him to remember what a good friend Vladimir Putin had been.
So what is Donald Trump doing to America's place in the world order then?
Well, I think we are steadily weakening America's position through these Trump policies. He doesn't see that, but I believe in Beijing, where they're watching the Ukraine play out very carefully. The Chinese leadership sees Taiwan being even more vulnerable given Trump's actions.
Given you say President Trump did a 180 on the US position on Ukraine, do you hold concerns that China could just take Taiwan without a US response?
Well, I'm very worried for Taiwan at the moment, and this goes back to Trump in his first term. He used to take his famous Sharpie pen from time to time, and he'd hold it up and he'd point to the tip and he'd say, "See that? That's Taiwan." And then he'd point to the vast, resolute desk that he sat behind and say, "That's China." That showed what his opinion was of the relative importance to the U.S. of Taiwan and China.
Is he paying enough attention at the moment to the national security, the international security challenge that China poses?
I don't think he is. I think what he really wants is the biggest trade deal in history between the U.S. and China. And despite the tariffs that have been put on in the first 100 days already between the U.S. and China, I think that remains Trump's main objective.
When it comes to China, 5 years ago, almost 5 years ago, an official at the Chinese embassy in Australia handed me a list that became known as the 14 grievances. Grievances that concerned freedom of expression, freedom of MPs to speak freely, conditions that the Chinese embassy said at the time they wanted changed in order to secure a better relationship with Australia. At the time, Donald Trump's then White House National Security Council criticised the list and said this was essentially China's warrior wolf behaviour. In your view, is that behaviour still going on? Is there a need for the United States to stand up to China in the Indo-Pacific?
The China-Russia axis, which is not perfected yet, but is well along to being created, really is a global threat. Ukraine's not a Russia war, it's a Russia-China war, given the assistance that China's provided Russia, laundering its sanctioned financial assets through China's system into the world, buying more oil and gas from Russia at a time when it was under Western sanctions. And I think China will expect the same from Russia. So we either face up to this increasing effort by China to achieve hegemony first along its Indo-Pacific periphery, and then I think more broadly, or we're going to be under even greater threat as the century goes on.
Just back on Russia, Donald Trump has said that essentially he trusts what Vladimir Putin is telling him at the moment about sticking to the terms of a ceasefire with Ukraine. Can Vladimir Putin be trusted to adhere to a ceasefire?
No, certainly not, based on his own words, based on the fact that if he really wants to recreate the Russian Empire, he has to have Ukraine. And that's not just his view, that's the view of many, many Russians. People shouldn't underestimate the level of support that Putin has, certainly the absence of any political opposition. Ronald Reagan used to say, trust but verify. I think in the case of the current Russian government, I'd say don't trust and don't be really sure that even verification will help you.
Donald Trump keeps praising Ronald Reagan, almost comparing himself with the former president. You've worked under both administrations. Are they comparable?
This isn't even close. This is Donald Trump, master marketer, taking a brand he knows is valuable in American politics and using labels like peace through strength that he does not understand to try and wrap himself in the Reagan brand. I don't think he'll be successful, but if he is, it'll be fraud.
When it comes to a national security perspective, is it a security risk to have an unelected billionaire as a key member of cabinet?
I think that a lot of people are concerned that a lot of these private citizens that have come in to help Trump don't have a clue what security concerns are. And we've seen evidence that even Trump's senior officials, in the case of Yemen, don't seem to know what classification means. So I think it's a general problem. I think Trump himself doesn't understand it. He once tweeted out a very sensitive overhead picture of a launch failure in Iran, a picture that opposing intelligence agencies couldn't have paid enough money to steal. And I think that kind of lax attitude, unfortunately, seems to permeate the early days of a second Trump term.
Just out of interest, what have you made of the relationship between Donald Trump and Elon Musk?
Well, I think as some members of Trump's team have said, Musk serves as a heat shield for Trump in his efforts to disrupt the bureaucracy and reduce its size.
In what way?
Well, to the extent there's been criticism, and there's been a little bit by Republicans and a lot, but ineffectively by Democrats, it's on somebody other than Donald Trump. And Trump has shown an uncanny ability over the years to use people and then ditch them when they become too problematic from his point of view. So I think he's happy to have Musk out there, although he's also put some constraints on him. When the episode of Musk apparently about to receive a briefing from the Pentagon on our China war plans, that didn't happen according to the administration. And Trump himself said publicly it shouldn't happen, and that Musk might have conflicts of interest dealing with China questions.
Is he setting him up to be a fall guy?
I think he's getting ready to throw him overboard. That's how Trump behaves with almost everybody except close family members.
Is that how he behaved with you?
Well, I resigned before he could do it, but he certainly fired other people that don't serve his purpose any longer. Look, a president's entitled to whomever he wants on his staff, but you'd think that things like loyalty and service would count, and they don't, except in terms of personal fealty to Donald Trump. Loyalty and service to the country aren't on his radar screen.
Ambassador Bolton, President Trump singled you out recently. He described you as somebody he said was a very dumb guy and said, quote, I used him well. Your response to that?
Yeah, I wonder who hired that guy. This is a man who has no limit to how many grievances that he has.
Why do you think the American people decided to go down the path of having him as President of the United States again?
Well, I think that they forgot a lot of what happened in Trump's term, particularly January the 6th. I think there was great dissatisfaction with Biden's performance on the economy. And I think the anti-woke feeling in the country, which probably takes up 80% of the people, contributed as well. But I don't think the American people voted for a lot of what has happened in the first 100 days. I think the 2024 election proves that America is still a center-right country. Really nothing more and nothing less.
Is the MAGA movement under Donald Trump now ironed into American society? He keeps making jokes about a third term.
Well, he's not going to get a third term, and I think that's clear to everybody other than some of his supporters. I think Trump is an aberration. I think he has been an aberration. I don't think being elected to a second term disproves that. Because Trump has no philosophy, has no grand strategy, doesn't even do policy, as most of us understand that term, his influence and his legacy will be minimal. And I think in 2028, you're going to have a wide open fight for the Republican nomination. I don't think JD Vance, although vice president, is inevitable by any stretch of the imagination. And I think the Democrats have their own problem. Their party is perhaps even more split than the Republican Party is, and no clear direction at this point.
Why do you think it's not inevitable JD Vance gets the nomination?
Well, if the economy turns sour, for example, as a result of the Trump tariffs or other exogenous events, that could be very damaging to Trump personally. His approval ratings could fall dramatically, and anybody associated closely with the administration would struggle to establish a separate identity. I think that's one very important reason Kamala Harris lost in 2024. She was tied inextricably to Joe Biden.
America has had political dynasties, the Clintons, the Kennedys. If Donald Trump is the MAGA king, is Donald Trump Jr. the crown prince?
Well, there was only one Kennedy president. There were two Bush presidents, that's true, but only one Clinton president. I don't think you can necessarily pass the Trump mantle on to anyone else.
Why?
Because he has no coherent philosophy, and ultimately to lead a movement, you have to have some underlying force that keeps people together. What allowed Trump to establish a small majority, a small popular majority, and an electoral college majority that was smaller than his victory in 2016 were a series of grievances, and many of those grievances are internally inconsistent. I think the future for the Republican Party really is a return to Reaganite principles, obviously in a different era, 50 years later, but the principles remain valid. Trump has no principles.
When you look at some of the international actions he's spoken about, taking control of Canada as a 51st state, taking Greenland, should the world be listening to him on this? Is he being serious?
Well, somebody once observed to me astutely, the way to handle Trump is like on a television set, just turn the volume off and don't listen to what he's saying. That works in part, but sometimes when Trump speaks, he's being very serious. In the case of invading Canada, it's not going to happen. Case of invading Greenland, it's not going to happen. Case of invading Panama, it's not going to happen. I don't know where he got these ideas of using military force, but it won't happen, and it's very detrimental to America because many of the things Trump is saying about, let's say, Canada, are what Putin is saying about Ukraine or China is saying about Taiwan.
So what's his strategy then behind tariffs, not just on Canada and Mexico, but countries around the world, including Australia? Is this a serious economic policy?
It's not a strategy, that's for sure. He likes tariffs. He believes in most cases, and we'll see if that's challenged in court, that he doesn't need additional legislative authority. And it reflects the Trump decision-making style. 25% tariffs on Canada and Mexico until a few days later when it's postponed. 10% tariffs on China until a few weeks later when it's 20%. Reciprocal tariffs on the whole world until a few weeks later when it's down to maybe 15 countries and certain selected products. And that's one reason why the tariffs may cause economic distress in the U.S. and around the world, not simply because of the tariffs themselves, which are a bad enough idea, but because of the uncertainty which is introduced into the economic system, something business simply can't abide. It wants certainty. Whatever the good news is or the bad news is, it wants certainty. There is no certainty inside Trump's brain.
Is there any economic method to what people are perceiving as madness around tariffs?
Well, it's the behavior of somebody who doesn't really understand the stakes of what he's doing. It's on, it's off. It's on in part, it's off in part. That's how he thinks. That's not a strategy, that's incoherent.
So if it's about the art of the deal, what's the deal?
The deal is keeping Trump at the center of the world stage.
And that's who you believe he is.
And it works too. The television stations in America are filled with Donald Trump, up one day, down the next, but always with something to say.
He's a reality TV president.
Well, I think the best example of that in action is the 50-minute discussion between Trump and Vance and Zelensky on February the 28th. there were serious issues to discuss between Ukraine and the Trump administration. What's the best place to discuss them? Behind closed doors. And instead, they played out disastrously on international television. What could be better for Trump? In fact, it said as he walked Zelensky out of the office before he kicked him out of the White House without lunch, that'll make for great TV.
What does the next few years, the 1,360 odd days of Donald Trump's presidency look like?
I think it looks like more of the same. If you believe and understand that there's no philosophy behind this, that it's all about Donald Trump and what benefits him, then you can see that the absence of coherent strategy is baked in. It was said to us in the first term that when Trump ran his Trump organization in New York, he never had a daily schedule. He'd come in every day and say, well, let's see what happens today. Now, maybe that's good for success in New York real estate. I can't say. It's not the way to run the U.S. government.
In the flurry of executive orders that came in on the night of January 20, one of the very first centred in part on you, removing your security detail at a time when Iran had been making threats on your life. When you heard that, what was your response?
Well, I was surprised, but not entirely.
Do you worry about it?
Well, I do. I've made separate arrangements, obviously. It's not the Secret Service, but I do believe that the threat is real, and so I have to do what I can. And he then did it to others like Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, former Secretary of Defense Mark Esper, former Chairman of the Joint Chiefs Mark Milley. Trump knows very well we are threatened by Iran, exactly as he is. Right before the election, the FBI arrested a Pakistani national operating for the Iranian Revolutionary Guard, trying to hire a hitman against Trump himself. This is a very real threat. This is not internet chatter. And it's obviously personal to those of us whose protection was withdrawn. But it's a national problem because it's a terrible signal to the likes of Iran and other American adversaries, and to anybody working for Donald Trump today. How did Secretary of State Marco Rubio here feel when he heard that Trump had removed his predecessor's Diplomatic Security Bureau protection? What does that do to Marco Rubio's willingness to go out on a limb for Donald Trump?
The threat against your life remains. He's removed your security detail. Has this president put your life more at risk than it was before?
Yeah, yes, I think he has. But in fact, he was asked by a reporter after the removal of Dr. Fauci's security detail, not because of Iran, but for other reasons. The reporter said, well, what if something happens to Bolton or Fauci? Would you consider yourself responsible? And Trump said, no.
So his decision has made you more fearful for your own life?
Well, I don't dwell on it because if I did, it would inhibit my ability to write analyses of the mistakes Trump is making. But it shows how, in Trump's world, everything centers around him. As I say, I can't ignore the personal stake I have in this, but this is a real national security mistake for the United States going forward.
So when you criticize him openly as you do, is it personal or is there political analysis behind this too?
Well, I criticized him before he withdrew the Secret Service protection. I don't think I've increased the volume of criticism. It's a full-time job. I believe it's important, notwithstanding that Trump will be in office for another almost 4 years, that people who do national security continue to write about what they think the correct policies are, because there will be a new president, Republican or Democrat, we don't know. But trying to ensure American national security is not something that changes just because Trump is president or one day will leave. We have to look forward at the long-term issues that affect national security for the U.S. and for its allies.
You talk about allies. One of the agreements that that was struck up between the United States, the United Kingdom and Australia was the Orcus arrangement for the United States to provide Australia with nuclear-powered submarines. He was asked in his first month or so in office about it and said, what does that mean? Do you think Donald Trump will stick to the Orcus alliance?
I would be worried that he won't.
Why?
Because he's not thinking very coherently about how to deal with the China threat, because the AUKUS capability, adding to Australia's naval assets, bringing the British back more heavily into a Pacific area of concern, and helping extend the capabilities of one of America's most important allies in the region, is part of dealing with the threat of China. And not to understand how big a program that is, how important it is, what a template it might provide for dealing with other countries in the region, Japan, South Korea, India at some point, shows a total lack of awareness of what's at stake in the Indo-Pacific.
Is China the biggest national security challenge that President Donald Trump should have in this term?
I think China remains the biggest threat to the West as a whole in the 21st century. The link between China and Russia shows it's a global threat, along with their outriders like North Korea, Iran, Belarus, Venezuela, Cuba. This is what a real national security strategy for the United States for the next 4 years should focus on. Whether there's any work done on that remains to be seen.
Ambassador Bolton, we've seen when it comes to China making threats around the world, its navy circumnavigating Australia, and so far no response from the American president, an ally of Australia. Does that surprise you?
Well, it's typical of Donald Trump that he doesn't think about problems in long-term perspective. I think to be a strong American president in this very dangerous century, he has to show the capability to respond to the threats that we have in common. And if he fails to, he will be regarded on that score alone as a huge failure.
We've seen, not just in the national security space when it's talking with allies and bringing them to the White House, having them on his turf, but in a vast array of domestic policy as well, that Donald Trump has once again employed the Steve Bannon flood the zone mentality. What's his idea, do you believe, behind putting so much out there so often?
Well, I think part of it is making sure he stays in the public eye. And there's some question how much longer this can go on. The executive orders that he signs with great fanfare so many nights of the week are getting less and less substantive. Executive orders primarily go to implementing statutes that Congress passed and ordering the executive branch. Trump is now putting in executive order format the kinds of instructions that earlier presidents did over the telephone, or did by way of a short memo, or by way of something the National Security Advisor might send out as a cabinet memo. So it's not that he's doing more at this point, he's just doing more so he can hold it up with a famous Donald Trump patented signature on it, more branding of everything being Donald Trump. That's really what we're down to now, I think.
So it doesn't need a black pen and a whole bunch of TV cameras.
No, but it's part of Donald Trump's style is that if he could be on TV 16 hours a day, I think he'd be delighted. They could put a closed-circuit TV camera in the Oval Office, and he could perform every minute he was there. That obviously is an exaggeration, but
he likes ratings, and would that rate?
Well, I'm afraid some of the cable news networks would carry that closed-circuit TV camera, watching him walk around and talking to his staff. He knows that's beyond the limit, but look at what he's done with expanding television already. It used to be at cabinet meetings, cabinet would be brought into the cabinet room, TV cameras would come in to take pictures and they'd be ushered out. Now, Trump's perfectly happy to have cabinet meetings in full view of the cameras, because what do? They showcase Donald Trump. He's on several occasions gone around the room to cabinet members, to each of them, and said, what do you think of being in the Trump administration? And they'd shower him with praise. It was all fairly embarrassing for everybody concerned except Donald Trump.
Trump TV is back.
It is, for 4 years.
In November, Americans in large volumes elected him as president. He won the popular vote that he hadn't done in the last 2 elections. What message is that sending to him and how he's going to govern over the next 4 years?
I think Trump knows that his victory wasn't that big, but in Donald Trump's world, there are winners and losers. He's obviously always a winner. And then there are big winners and small winners, and he wants to be a big winner. If he says it often enough, some people will believe it. But Republican and Democratic political strategists alike know that it was a victory, but it was a thin victory. And looking toward the 2026 midterm elections, people are wondering how much of that coalition will still be together when it comes to House and Senate elections, which will be critical for the last 2 years of Trump's term.
How critical, though? Because essentially right now he's governing on his own, for his own.
To have lasting change in the government, you have to have change in the statutes. So even cabinet departments like the Department of Education that he's trying to take apart will still exist as long as the statutory words remain in the U.S. Code. And a Democratic president, perhaps elected in 2028, could recreate the department, take the programs that have been moved elsewhere, move them right back in, and start it up again. That's why looking at everything that's happened in the first 100 days, you have to ask, how long will that actually last? We could go through the cost of tearing a lot of things down, and then a few years later, the cost of putting them all back together again. The net result might look exactly the same, except we will have wasted a lot of money in the process, whereas a more precise and targeted and strategic approach might actually have resulted in permanent change.
A majority of Americans admire him, Republicans admire him. Is there anything you admire about Donald Trump?
Well, you have to acknowledge that he's still president. As we say in America, well, if you're so smart, how come you're not president? And I acknowledge that reality.
Had you thought about running before?
Well, I did think about it in other years. I ultimately didn't. I think it's we're in a situation now where only a Donald Trump could run as a non-politician, and he did it successfully twice.
Is that the future of American politics then? The president's going to be a non-politician, somebody from the celebrity world, from the world of entertainment?
Well, I think there's certainly too much in the Trump presidency and too much in Congress of people who don't really understand they're there to run the government. They're performance artists. They care about their TV ratings, their social media metrics. In Congress, some of them don't even bother to go to congressional hearings to ask questions of witnesses. They go to perform. Ultimately, that's a breakdown of civil society and government itself. And if that trend doesn't change, that could be very dangerous. And it's not true only in the United States. It's true in many of the democratic countries around the world.
What is the influence of Donald Trump doing in Western democracies around the world? Elon Musk and Donald Trump tried to push for a far more conservative victory in Germany. That didn't happen. But what is the impact of Donald Trump's presidency and his move further to the right across Western democracies?
I think it's very hard to say he's having an impact because I don't think he has a philosophical direction. I think it's the effort by people to try and find patterns where perhaps they don't exist. It's the case in Germany that the effort to affect the election probably backfired. I think the effect in Canada certainly wasn't what Trump expected. It turns out that trying to affect the result in a friendly democracy often doesn't produce the result that people might think. Everybody's got an opinion of politicians in other countries, but opening your mouth and saying what it is may not be the smartest thing politically.
Going back to Elon Musk and Donald Trump, one of the aspects that they have looked at through DOGE, or the Department of Government Efficiency, is USAID. You worked there for 2 years. When you saw what they did to that organisation, how did you react?
I thought it was a mistake. I thought certainly after 4 years of Biden and before that 8 years of Obama, not much changed during the first Trump term, that there were undoubtedly a lot of things that should be done differently. But I remember what we tried to do in the Reagan administration was make AID a more effective instrument of American bilateral foreign policy. We didn't go as far as I wanted to go at the time, and I'm sure that in a second Trump term, a lot of changes could be made. But what they did instead of reforming it was, in the words of the famous Army briefer in Vietnam, we had to destroy that village in order to save it. They've destroyed AID. It will have to be built back because we need a bilateral foreign assistance program. But the damage that they've done will take a long time to repair.
And what about America beyond 2028? Clearly, Americans voted him in, so they're along for the ride for the next 4 years.
Well, they're along for the ride for some of it. We'll see what happens in the 26th election. I'm worried that dissatisfaction with Trump may open an opportunity for the Democratic left, and that the swing in 2028 could go to a Bernie Sanders lookalike in the Democratic Party.
Or even Bernie Sanders?
If Bernie's still around in 2028, I hope he is, but I hope he doesn't get their nomination. The cost of a Donald Trump presidency is not just the damage that Trump does, it's the damage a Democratic successor might do.
So is American politics right now in a pendulum? Are we going from right to left to right?
I think it's very hard to predict because we've never had a circumstance of a two-term president separated by another term, faced with a term limit at the end of the second term. So there's simply no dynamic, not just in recent years, but in any part of the American experience that tells us what comes next. Nor have we ever had a president like Donald Trump.
Could you ever again?
I hope not.
Just on the Democrats, Ambassador Bolton, right now they seem leaderless. Everybody is starting to put their hands up, whether it's Bernie Sanders, whether it's AOC alongside him, or Governor Gavin Newsom talking to people he often disagrees with, Steve Bannon amongst them. Where do they stand now?
I think the Democrats are lost in the wilderness. I'm sure they'll find a way out at some point. If they go to the left, that'd be very bad for the country. We need, certainly in the national security space, a Democratic Party that believes in a strong American foreign policy, a Reaganite kind of policy. There used to be a national security wing on the Democratic side, but it's been invisible for a long time. The trouble with Trump is his policies look a lot like leftist Democratic policies in years gone by. We need a party that believes in a strong America.
He's modeled himself on Reagan. Americans have backed him in. In his view, he is the right man for the job. Is he?
Trump said during his 2016 acceptance speech at the Republican convention, describing the problems the country faced, "I alone can fix it." That should have been a signal right then that he was the wrong man for the job. And I think the historical verdict on Trump will be devastating.
Why?
It's rare to see one person being so destructive. He's more like a vandal warlord than a constructive president. And I think that's what history will judge him on very severely.
So November 2028, is America still the land of the free and the home of the brave?
I think so, unquestionably. I think it's way overstated to say that Trump is an existential threat to democracy, that somehow it's like the end of the Roman Republic. For one thing, we haven't had a Catiline or a Pompey or a Sulla to precede Trump, and it's certainly the case that Donald Trump is no Julius Caesar.
Donald Trump is back as America's 47th president. What does this period of time in America's history look like to you?
Well, Winston Churchill once said, you can always count on the Americans to do the right thing after they've tried everything else. And I think Donald Trump represents everything else.
Ambassador Bolton, thanks very much for your time.
Thanks for having me.